In our first two episodes of Regenerate, both Joel Salatin and Isabella Tree, both of whom, of course, are radical farmers one way or the other, were talking about their reinvention of the relationship of farming, of being human with nature itself. This theme of reinvention, of course, is core to our Regenerate series. And for this show, we're going to take a step back or sideways or perhaps forward and think about the very idea of reinvention and nature and how it all ties together in organizational theory, what it means in the real world and what it means for us trying to rethink farming and soil in the 21st century. Frederic Laloux is an organizational theorist. He's based in upstate New York in Ithaca. He's originally from Belgium, Brussels, and he's the author of Reinventing Organizations, a very radical way of rethinking our relationship with organizations in a complex world. Frederic, how do you define nature? Because I think it's core to what we're trying to do in Regenerate. What for you is nature?
It's both this word that I love and I find problematic. I love it because I notice as soon as I'm in nature, there's something profound in me that shifts and that relaxes. And so I'm absolutely convinced that, we need nature. There's all, for instance, these interesting studies that show that people in hospital rooms, those people who have a window that overlooks nature as compared to people who have a window that looks at, a dead wall, people who see nature heal more quickly just from seeing nature. And what I find problematic about it is the fact that it puts us outside of nature, right? That's one of the big dramas of the last 100 years, is that we've really come to see humans as separate from nature. And so nature is this thing that we venture out into, and we've forgotten that we are nature. There's nature in me, right? I am a complex ecosystem. As most listeners will probably know, we have 10 times more bacteria in us than we have cells. So am I really me, or am I a superorganism? And so, I am nature. It still blows. Yeah. So there's this word that is at the same time something that just calls for it. There's this huge longing to be in nature, to be part of nature. And then I can't quite, decondition myself from seeing myself as separate of nature, even though I don't want to. So it is really a concept that we have to get wrap our heads around in whole new ways.
Yeah, wrapping our heads around is a nice way of putting it. And I know you're very much into metaphor. Frederic, in our last episode, I talked to Isabella Tree, who has written, I'm sure you're familiar with it, a book about rewilding her farm in southern England. What she did, and I think what Joel Salatin has done, is step back from nature. What Isabel Tree said to nature essentially is, okay, you're in control, and allowed her farm to be rewilded. Farming, of course, is the classic in the 20th century. Farming was controlled by this top-down system, which has resulted, as everybody knows now, in an environmental catastrophe. Is this idea of rewilding, of stepping back, is this a universal theme? I know you write about it in your book, maybe not exactly about rewilding, but about this challenge and opportunity in stepping back from controlling something external.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I like metaphors and the power of metaphors. And the dominant metaphor of modernity has been to see everything as machines, right? So we've come to see even a farm as a machine, right? We talk about factory farming or industrial farming. And so it's more than a metaphor. It's the whole way we see things. And because we see things in that way, there's other things that we're blind to. So what we see is basically a production system. And if it isn't producing as much as we want, then we have to change the inputs so that we get the outputs that we want, right? And we talk about efficiency in farming, and yeah, maybe we should have a little bit more pesticides or a little bit more insecticides or a bit more fertilizers, and we just play that whole system as if it was a factory, right? And the language just shows it, right? There's these inputs and outputs and resources and efficiency. And the big shift with regenerative agriculture is that we see land no longer as a machine, but as a living system, a living organism that is so complex that no linear relationship between input and output can ever work satisfactorily. And this same shift from viewing the world as a machine to viewing the world as a living organism happens in every domain right now. The metaphor of machine is breaking down everywhere. And so I've written about what this means for organizations, for management, right? We have this old way of looking at organizations as machines, and it's no longer working. It's creating just these incredible amounts of pain in organizations. And we now see organizations that operate in a whole different way because they see themselves as living organisms, self-managing, self-organizing systems. And what happens in there is extraordinary. Like their level of happiness, of productivity, of capacity to pursue a purpose is just, orders of magnitude bigger than in the old machines. But the same thing is happening in medicine. We used to see the human body as a machine, and we start to see it as a living system. So this is happening in domain after domain. And it's just so interesting to see how we really live in these interesting times where an old metaphor that served us relatively well for a while is breaking down everywhere. And a new, more powerful metaphor is emerging.
I really like the way you think about this. And one word that comes to mind is extraction. In the industrial world, we've always seen external things as opportunities for extraction. So management sees labor as something to extract value from. Farmers see the land as something to extract value from. And of course, the irony, as you point out, and as Isabella Tree and Joel Salatin have pointed out, is the reverse is true. Actually, extraction is resulting in impoverishment. Is that fair?
It's absolutely fair. I mean, you just have to look at surveys of the level of engagement in organizations, and it's ridiculously low, right? There's surveys after surveys show that like we're in the low, tens of percentage of people who say that they're really meaningfully engaged in their workplace. And you see that in the United States, you see that in Europe, you see that elsewhere. And it's so sad. Like there's this enormous waste of human potential, just as there's this enormous waste of natural potential, because we've ended up putting ourselves into these tiny little boxes with fixed reporting lines, with carrots and sticks all over. And we've just drained life out of organizations. And you see how quickly life rebounds if you just change the conditions, right? You see it in nature, you see it in these farms, and you see it in organizations. If you switch to another type of management that's based on a whole different worldview, it's incredible how quickly life comes back. The number of initiatives that suddenly emerge because people all along have been waiting to express their potential, have been waiting to bring their unique gifts, and our current systems have blocked them from doing that.
Frederic, you have some wonderful examples in your book and in your work of organizations that have flourished when we've stepped back from them, when we allow them to be self-managed, when we introduce this idea of wholeness. There's one in the Netherlands in particular that you might talk a little bit about.
Yeah, there's this organization called Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, which means neighborhood care. And, the whole industry of neighborhood care, so basically nurses that go to people's homes, often older people or people that have had an accident and that need home care, has really gone to the utter level of madness of this machine paradigm, starting in 1980s and 1990s. We got to the extremes where every day a different nurse would be sent to these clients, so that the staffing could be most flexible. So clients didn't know their nurses, nurses didn't know their clients, and nurses would have a sheet that says, hey, you start at 8 o'clock in the morning with this person, and because you're changing a compression stocking, and a compression stocking lasts 2.5 minutes because there's a standard time, 2.5, and then Google Maps calculate that you should be at the next client at 8:08, and then you scan when you come in, the barcode sticker on the client's door so that the system knows if you're early or late, and so that we can, improve that and give you training and do continuous improvement. I mean, we've just gotten into this, horrible system that looks surface of things, but is completely demeaning. And is a system that the clients and the nurses ended up hating because they were all just cogs in a bigger machine that was designed somewhere over which they had no influence. And then comes along a man called Just de Block, who was one of these nurses, and at some point said, this system is horrible, it can't be changed from the inside, and he created Buurtzorg, originally with 4 people, 12 years ago. Now there are 14,000 people. I don't know the exact market share, but there's something like 2/3 of all neighborhood nurses now in the Netherlands that work for Buurtzorg. So they've basically steamrolled the market. And what they've done is they've simply created teams of nurses, 10 to 12, who are self-managing. So there's no team leader among them, who have their own dedicated clients, and whose work is not to optimize every shot or bandage that they give, but to see how their clients could lead the most rich and autonomous lives that they can. So a Buurtzorg nurse, the first thing that they do is sit down with the client, drink a cup of coffee, and say, hey, where are you at? What is it that you can still do? What is it you'd like to gain back? And they have very profound conversations with people. Often they meet their children. They help these older folks rebuild a network of support with neighbors, with, the level of relationships is just so beautiful. Often they work for years with these people, sometimes till terminal care. It's just an amazingly beautiful relationship. And obviously everybody loves that. The nurses, they got their life and purpose back. The clients, of course, love that kind of thing. But here's where it really gets interesting, is that studies have shown that Buurtzorg is actually radically more efficient than other organizations, that Buurtzorg uses less than 40% of the hours prescribed by doctors, because patients become autonomous so much faster. And so we have this incredible paradox where people could say, but yeah, nobody has time to drink coffee. We're trying to shave every minute out of every shot that we give. Here you actually show that actually by building these deep relationships, you're actually saving, the Dutch healthcare system hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And so it's a system that is just win-win-win. The clients love it, the nurses love it, the state love it, the medical outcomes are better. It's just better in every way. And what is fascinating about this is that there's nothing in terms of assets that has changed, or in terms of resources, right? It's the same nurses, it's the same bandages, it's the same syringes. The only thing that has changed is the perspective with which we look at work and organizations. And so we have now 14,000 nurses in Buurtzorg, this incredibly efficient organization that are all organized in little self-managing teams of 10 to 12. There isn't a single manager in the organization, in the sense of there is no boss-subordinate relationship anywhere, right? And in the old machine paradigm, that sounds completely crazy. You go how could that ever work? This, of course, is chaos. And then until you realize, just the nature, there is other systems, there's other rules that emerge. There's, Buurtzorg has a lot of very clear rules about how they're operating, which makes that they don't need, the stifling effect of bureaucracy and management, and they can become this extraordinarily productive and human organization.
You bring up nature, Frederic. Do you think that the top-down industrial mode of organization was quote unquote unnatural, and that the Buurtzorg, the model that you're now referring to, somehow mimics nature in its self-organization, in its core networking effect and impact?
Yeah, it's been really interesting and fascinating to me that all of the founders or leaders of these new types of organizations use this metaphor of nature, or almost all of them, right? They talk about their organization as a living system or as an ecosystem, or so the metaphor is very, very present for me. But I'm not an expert in biomimicry, say, right, or in the complex adaptive systems in nature. But some people who've read my book and who come from that perspective say, well, it's almost a one-on-one. Like, obviously, you must have studied, nature and the mechanisms of nature very deeply. And I was like, no, I've just studied these organizations. And to my knowledge, none of these founders of these organizations studied nature. It's just that when you come at it from a perspective that we will treat an organization as a living system, you naturally stumble upon the same principles and mechanisms that nature has been operating with for billions of years.
Yeah, I think some of it has to do with power. And there's an irony here. What Isabella Tree, I think, found is that by stepping back from nature, she ultimately empowered herself as a farmer. And I think what you're arguing in your organizational theory is that by handing back power to the network, by doing away, by essentially blowing up this top-down hierarchical system, we also empower ourselves. This is not anarchy, is it?
No, there's a lot of systems and roles and structures just as much as in traditional organizations. Simply, it's not a top-down system. And I mean, it is not rocket science. Like, think about it, right? In the machine metaphor, in our current organizations, we often think that having a few really clever people, the clever engineers, lock them up in a room, and then they will find a solution and will communicate it to everybody else, and they will just have to execute. Well, it doesn't take a genius to understand that if you're an organization of 10,000 people, there's more intelligence and more motivation and more energy with 10,000 people than with 4 clever people that you lock up in a room, right? And you see that time and time and time again. The hard stuff is that leaders currently are not used to thinking in those ways. And so they have a very naive way to think about this. They think either we have traditional top-down structure, or it's sort of 1960s, everybody can do whatever they want. We'll sit in endless meetings. We'll wait till consensus emerges after midnight. But that is, of course, a ridiculous way to look at things. Like, if you look at nature, there's tons of structures and mechanisms. There's laws of nature, and in the same ways, there's structures and mechanisms and laws to make self-management work. There's ways in which we can empower 10,000 people or more to do amazing things. But it requires that leaders try to wrap their head around this and understand this, and then let go of their willingness to control everything and actually realize that they're much more powerful when they empower the system, right? A way that leaders have said that is like, before that, I had the illusion of control, right? I had the illusion of power, and I had to give up on that illusion to have real control and real power.
Yeah, there's something almost tragically Shakespearean about this, is that the more power we have, or the more power we want, the less power we have. Perhaps that metaphor now is being played out in America in the presidency. Frederic, Joel Salatin. Well, let me just, and we'll come back to that. Joel Salatin, our first interviewee, he's a farmer in the Shenandoah Valley, a little bit south of where you are in Ithaca, New York. Jokingly refers to himself as a lunatic farmer. Do you think, in terms of rethinking these traditional structures of power, of letting go, we all need to become a little bit like Joel? We need to become lunatics?
I have mixed feelings about this, because I think it plays, like, if we say that we're lunatics, it plays into the hand that these systems are sort of these 1960s weirdo systems, when there's actually real knowledge and science behind this, we now know how to make self-management work on very large scales with thousands of people. And, we know that we need to shift how we make decisions. It's no longer top down, but it's not a free for all. It's not consensus. There are very clear mechanisms for who can make what decisions. We know how we need to deal with conflict in the traditional organizations. We have to refer to the boss, and then the boss, will decide if there's a conflict between two people. Well, now we have to do it in a different way. We have to decide how information gets shared. We have to decide, do we still need budgets or not? Who gets a pay raise at the end of the year? So there's all of these very practical questions that we need to solve if we want to have, an organization work in a self-managing way. And the good thing is we know the answers to this. Like, we know how this works. This is no longer a mystery. Yeah, the people who are doing this now are still pioneers, and they do things so differently that you could call them lunatics, but there's actually a real system behind the madness. And I think it might not take that long, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years, until this becomes the new normal. And we look at old traditional top-down leaders and say like, so you're still doing the top-down thing. Oh, okay. Right? Because at some point this will suddenly seem ridiculous. Like, you're still disempowering people by, being their boss and they're your subordinate.
I really like your ideas, but when I look at corporations, the most successful corporations in the United States, for example, at the moment are probably Amazon and Apple. Now, Amazon is still run by a brilliant founder who turned it from a tiny little startup into $1 trillion company. And of course, whenever we think of Apple, we still think of Steve Jobs, the ultimate corporate dictator. What companies, large successful companies in the United States on a corporate level, work according to your laws?
That's very clear. In the United States, there are no big corporates yet. The United States is lagging behind Europe in some ways. What you see in the United States is more, examples of little pockets in larger organizations who are trying this out and seeing success. In Europe, there are a number of interesting, larger examples. There's an interesting story, for instance, unfolding right now with Decathlon. Decathlon is the world's largest sports retailer. They're huge in Europe, in China, in Brazil, in India, etc. They just entered the US, so they're less famous in the US. And they've just, going massively in this direction. They're now close to 100,000 people. And they're just incredibly, incredibly successful with it. And I'll give you an example. At Decathlon, they used to have a very powerful team of a few people who was in charge of making the biggest decisions of all, which is, are we going to enter a new country and which one? And are we going to open stores in existing countries? And with this system, every 2 or 3 years, they would enter a new country, and they would do it in a traditional way, right? Where they would sort of consulting way, they would look at the map of the world and, which are still the large countries with GDP where we're not, and what kind of sports do they play, and do we have an offer? And then let's go there, and then let's appoint somebody to be the head of the country. And then they basically replicate the model that was first started in France. And they were successful with it. They were one of the most successful companies and fastest growing companies in France. And then there's a new CEO coming in, has a whole different perspective on these things. And one of the first things he does is he disbands that little team of 4. And instead, he puts a call out to everyone in the organization. I think at the time they were 60,000, and says, if ever you feel like you might be interested in opening up a country, let me know and come that day to that place, right? And a few hundred people showed up, and he just threw out a massive invitation and said, are you interested in opening up a country? Go, study it. We'll give you some money to do it. Here's a team of really experienced people who can give you advice. But there's no formal mechanism to give you a green light. Like, if you believe you can do it, do it. And then the most extraordinary things started happening. People decided that they wanted to open up all sorts of countries. And beautiful stories started emerging that you could have never planned centrally. Like, 7 countries in Africa were started because Decathlon has this mission of making sports accessible to all. And so even in Africa, even in the poorest countries. And there were two young women who decided they wanted to open up South Africa. And they decided that they would open the first store not in Johannesburg like everybody else would do it, but in Soweto, the historical black township. And that was unheard of. Nobody ever opens a first store in Soweto. But they just decided that was the right thing to do. And now Decathlon has several stores in South Africa, but it's apparently the most loved brand because South Africans just love it for the fact that they would look at Soweto first. None of this was planned centrally. And Decathlon now will open up in 4 years more stores than they have opened up, more countries than they've opened up in 40 years. They will have grown from 60,000 to 100,000 people in less than 4 years. And for the first time in their history, a lot of these countries are profitable already at the end of the first year, which had never happened because people just localize things so much more because they have so much more freedom. And it all started with just go out there, right? People opened up Albania. Now, Albania on the list of GDPs is probably, pretty low, but who cares? Decathlon wasn't capacity constrained, cash constrained to do that. So those are the kind of examples that we just start to see emerging. These is really early days where you have a company that was already incredibly successful, growing fast, that is just, even more successful. In your question, there is this question like, prove that this works, right? By being more successful. And I just want to go back to the question that, that is itself sort of a metric of the old system, right? Of growth, which is ultimately results in some form of cancer, if it's just extractive growth. And so next to the question of like, does this work in terms of organizations growing? Decathlon is also an interesting example because 4 years ago, they invited everybody. At the time, there were 80,000 people, 2 years ago, to do, the new strategic planning. And 20,000 people participated in that process. And things emerged that would have never emerged otherwise, including a massive concern for the environment. And so Decathlon is now massively waking up, eco-designing all of its products, looking at its entire supply chain in ways that no corporate social responsibility program would have ever achieved top-down. And so that's another factor which to me is interesting, is how do we even define success? And so yes, Decathlon is growing like crazy, but am I really happy that it is growing like crazy? What I'm really happy about is this massive environmental and climate awakening that is happening, where people feel like they can finally talk about what is important for their own integrity because there's less fear, and they can actually charge ahead and do all of these environmental initiatives independently of some top-down, corporate social responsibility program.
So what you're really saying is that this reinvention of organizations, this replacement of hierarchies with networks, lends itself to long-term rather than short-term thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously we're at the very beginning of all of this, but just this very notion of growth, for growth's sake is something that obviously we will want to question at some point, right? And so seeing an organization like Decathlon that now, is stepping in the footsteps of Patagonia and is starting to, buy back its own products and then repair them and then resell them and then recycle them, it's just hugely exciting to me.
So yeah, so this idea of regeneration then we're finding is happening in parallel. It's happening, as you've pointed out, in the corporate world. We're seeing it in nature. Is there an overarching narrative here, Frederic? Or do these things need to take place in an almost chaotic way within complex systems?
Yeah, I now very much believe that these systems are so complex that we cannot plan them. And that there's sort of cross-fertilizations in ways that we could never anticipate, right? There is, something like Decathlon suddenly happening now. There's a mass awakening around the environment that might trigger other things. Maybe some of these people now will buy from regenerative farms their food at home, right? And people who are exposed to this in organizations might look at their body in a whole different way and might start to think about, the kind of medicine that they want in a different way. And I've heard from farmers who do regenerative farming, but do it in terms of management in a horribly hierarchical and sometimes abusive ways. And then people in there revolt and say, but isn't that contradictory? We can't do regenerative farming and then not think about how we treat each other as human beings, right? And so there's obviously links between all of these things, and how this will unfold and which domain will, start to shift and topple first, I don't know. But I think it's fascinating to see how this will all unfold.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and it's also fascinating to listen to your choice of language. You talk about cross-fertilization. You're taking language from nature, from traditional agriculture. Do you think there's something essential about that? Do you think we need to return to a simpler language, a language of pre-industrial culture, to make sense of complex systems?
Yeah, absolutely. So far we've talked a lot about the self-management, but there's other aspects that I think are just as important. Is that the culture in organization has largely been a culture of dehumanization, right? It's a culture where most of us felt that we had to use a professional mask and hide behind a professional mask in order to be seen and acceptable. And it's a pretty sort of masculine, rational mask. And we don't show our emotions, we don't show our deeper hopes and longings. And I think if organizations are often so lifeless, it's because we bring so little life to them, because we hide most of the life behind our professional masks. And part of that is adopting a whole lingo in organizations that is a very abstract engineering-like language. And on the other hand, very simple, everyday, fundamental language to what it means to be human, which feels out of place in organizations. Like, we don't talk about love, we don't talk about care, we don't talk about our emotions, and we certainly don't talk about spirituality, if that's important for people. And so a lot of humanity is lost. And what I find interesting to see in some of these organizations is how we indeed return to simple language, to simpler everyday language, where we can actually talk about care and emotions, where people can actually hug each other without feeling unsafe, without feeling like, hey, if I show too much of my personality, of who I am, my quirks, it might up, being used against me. I'd rather be safe and hide behind a professional mask. There's an enormous joy and liberation when we can show up with our whole selves.
Yeah, I think that humanism that you talk about, Frederic, is really important. One of the things that struck me about our conversation with Isabella Tree was that she said this implicitly, but it was fairly self-evident from the conversation, that the more she stepped back from nature, the more she handed power back to nature from her farm, the more human she became. So our humanism perhaps is rooted in giving up power. The industrial modernist assumption is we become more human by gaining power. The reverse is actually true.
Yeah, maybe it's interesting to make this distinction between, power over and power with. These were words that Mary Parker Follett, a woman, one of the first sort of management thinkers, who was extraordinary, and then, as often precursors and certainly women, she was forgotten. But she, talked about power over or power with. And so I think power is an amazing thing. And we want nature to be powerful. I want everyone in an organization to be powerful. In traditional organizations, we've seen power as a zero-sum game. So if I at the top give up power, then other people can be empowered. But that's not actually true. By creating this system, everybody becomes more powerful, including the people at the very top. But it's no longer power over, right? English language, unfortunately, it's so rich, but only has the same word. Like, for instance, in my native French, we do have a difference between pouvoir, sort of power over, and puissance, which is sort of power with or sort of power from within. And so I wouldn't want to demonize power. I think we should simply take away this power over this way of dominating, which in the end makes me poorer too. I think some people say this beautifully, like we, for the longest time, have been hunter-gatherers, right? For 98% of human existence, we human beings have been hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers lived in circles without any formal power hierarchy. No power over. So I think indeed that sort of this power over and this domination is very natural to us and causes actually a lot of pain in both parties, the dominator and the dominated. And one way to look at organizations is to see like all of these things that we put into place to justify something that deep down we know isn't really working, is sort of unjustifiable. And then we give corner offices, and then we dress differently, right? And we give different cars, and we give different stock options, and we all of these things to sort of justify, oh, if that person is treated differently, then indeed they must be special. And then indeed, that might justify why they have power over other people. But ultimately, I think everybody in those systems is cheated.
Well, Frederic, I really want to thank you. I think this conversation in itself is an example of how collaboration can work. I hope I haven't had too much power over you or you over me, but this is a particularly human conversation. And I look forward to talking to you more about regeneration. And I think these are ideas that will really enrich our series about how not only to reinvent agriculture, regenerate agriculture, but how to regenerate humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you.